Greetings and welcome to Maisha Kazini. In this video, I want to talk about the recently concluded US presidential elections. And this video is inspired not by the elections themselves, but in Kenyans' interpretation of the elections and in the interpretation of Kenya's interpretation of elections. Many Kenyans are celebrating the Trump win. And the argument is that since Trump is a racist and doesn't care for Africa, maybe he can keep out of Africa's business and leave us alone. And their evidence is that Democrats are hypocrites. They talk about human rights and all that, but what they're really doing is meddling in our countries. And the example that is often given is that of Obama, who okayed the bombing of Libya and the destabilization of the whole Sahel region. But at the same time, he was the first Black president and supposedly cared about minorities. So the argument is generally that basically it's an adaptation of Malcolm X's analogy of the fox and the wolf. And they say that at least Trump is a wolf. We know he's a wolf, unlike the Democrats who are foxes. They come smiling at us, but they still do the same things that they condemn others for doing. And then there are people who read this celebration of Trump's victory as evidence that Kenyans are conservative because they're evangelical. And also they say that which is what Kenyans also say, they say that they are tired of the current US ambassador, and maybe now that Trump is coming into office, they can recall this ambassador. I have a problem with both these interpretations. One is, I think there's a very simplistic interpretation of what evangelical Christianity means in Africa. It is not what it means in the United States. And every time I make that argument, I'm not heard. I guess, us Africans, we're not supposed to know anything, I guess. And so there's a tendency to import American evangelical politics to Kenya wholesale without recognizing that Africa has a different relationship to the Christian religion than America and than Europe does. The Kenyan interpretation concerns me a lot, and it has concerned me for a number of months. Kenyans think that the left is the Democrats when the Democrats are actually in the center. They are not at the left. And every time I say that, people tend to get irritated for some reason. But more than that, both sides fail to understand that Kenyans' understanding of US politics is through the lens of conservative media in the United States itself. Most Kenyans get their news on the US from Fox News, and at the very best, if it's not Fox, it will be CNN and MSNBC, sometimes ABC, but that's about it. So our view of the United States tends to be very conservative, and it's not a religious thing, it's a media thing. And then in another video, I will also be arguing that it's also about the middle class. The middle class tends to identify more with the Republicans for various class reasons. And I have an article which I've written about conservatism in Kenya, and I will share the link below this video. I'm going to also share a link to a documentary called Broadcast Blues to show how different regulations in the US over the last 40 years are what have produced this scenario where most of the talk radio in the US, where Americans get their news from, it tends to be conservative because it is dominated by corporate interests. So that could explain a lot about how Kenyans understand US politics and why they take the positions they take. So in this video, I want to talk about the different political persuasions so that we have a better understanding of what was at stake in this election. So the point of this video is to explain what does the right mean and what is the left, so that we stop saying things like CNN and the Democrats are on the left. They are not, they're in the center. So where did these terms left and right come from? They came from the days of the French Revolution. It was about the the discussions in the National Assembly were the people who supported the monarchy or the ancien regime, the old regime, where they sat in the assembly was on the right, and the people who were for the republic sat on the left. So that's what left and right mean. And over the decades, left and right have kind of been modified so that now it's a spectrum. It's not just two pillars, it's a spectrum of people who vary in terms of their position with regards to the left and to the right. So under the right these days, the right are the people who we know in America to be Republicans. In the UK, we know them to be conservatives. And in places like France, they have the party of Marie Le Pen, which is considered at the extreme right. So you hear there are even adjectives. There's the extreme right, the center right, the center left, and the extreme left. So there's a whole spectrum of these parties. So the parties on the right generally are the Republicans in the US. There's also the Libertarian Party in the US. The media houses are now the Fox News, and journalists like Tucker Carlson are on the right. Also, you have intellectuals like Thomas Sowell. And I'm mentioning him because there are a lot of times people say that I sound like him, and yet maybe we might say the same thing at one point or another, but we are completely opposite in terms of our politics. So when people tell me that, then I know people have not understood political philosophy of the West. Then you have the center. The center is the place where people tend to not want to disturb the system too much. They just want inclusion in terms of identity. So this is where the woke politics comes in. And the idea is that you don't need to change too much except bring more minorities on the table. So the media houses that take this position are CNN, MSNBC, and then you have the Democrats. This is the Democratic Party is now at the center. And this is where you have people using words like moderates. So even if they are moderate Republican or moderate left, those are the people considered to be at the center who don't take very hard lines. And then you also have liberals. Liberals are not the left. Please, Kenyans, liberals and the left are not the same. So liberals are in the center, and they tend to only want changes in terms of identity, but not in terms of structure and institutions. And then you have the left. The left is where now you have in the US third parties like the Green Party, whose flag bearer was Jill Stein this year. And you also have the Party of Socialism and Liberation, PSL. There is also the Social Democrats, tend to be more on the left. America also has a Communist Party, believe it or not, and it's actually quite an old party. So these are the parties that you will find on the left. The left are also known as radicals. The right talk about them as the far left. So what they say is that the Democrats are left and the real left is the far left, which is what causes the confusion in Kenya. And in the UK, this is where Labour was supposed to be. But if you followed the story of Jeremy Corbyn and how he was purged out of the Labour Party, it's because the Labour Party thought that he was too far left. And then Keir Starmer has now brought the Labour Party to the center, sort of moving towards the right. And usually, if you see, even in the Democratic Party, there was a coup like that. When you see coups like that, it's usually by people who are college educated, who find it difficult to integrate in the Republican Party, and so they go to the Democratic Party and try to move the Democratic Party or the Labour Party slightly to the right. So that is what has happened, and is actually part of the problem of why the Democrats lost the election. So I want to now talk about the difference between the right and the left. Okay, the right generally tend to believe in social hierarchy or what they call tradition, but really it's social hierarchy. I think, in my view, it is rooted in the medieval days, in the monarchies of Europe, where there was a belief that everybody is born according to a structure. You have the aristocrats who have the right to everything, and the serfs who have to work for everybody else. But of course, now that is so politically incorrect, especially after the revolutions, especially in Europe. So now, what they say should be preserved is tradition. And in fact, actually, every time you hear Kenyans talking about tradition, I think that, personally, I think that's the tradition they are talking about. They are thinking in terms of this rigid, everybody know their place, stick to your lane kind of thing. There's no democracy, there's no need for change. And now we've started to think that our cultures were like that, which is very problematic. Then and then also because of that, this idea of tradition or the system or hierarchy tends to become like racism. If we remember, racism is about superiority of one race above all the others. So what was originally simply classes has now, when we come into contact with it, it becomes race, and then there's a hierarchy. Whites at the top, blacks at the very bottom. We are the labor, we are the serfs. We are the ones who are supposed to do the work for the system. Then the right also believes in law and order. What does this mean? It means there tends to be a bit too much faith in the law, and also a very harsh views of punishment, refusal to see the social circumstances in which people live. And if you start saying, oh, before we jail somebody for stealing, we also have to see, did they have food? They consider that an excuse. And that is what law and order ideas are about. And I hear Kenyans saying law and order, and I'm like, I don't know whether we know what we are saying. One example that made me really worried was this story of a young man who had no money, and he wanted to get his wife and newborn child out of Kenyatta Hospital. And he was arrested and taken to court. And I was like, this guy is doing the right thing by his family. Why is he being taken to court? But some people were telling me, oh, but he broke the law. I mean, we have to, and what I was saying is we have to remember how healthcare is expensive. He was doing the right thing. He just didn't have the money. He should not be considered a criminal. Eventually, he was bailed, which I still think was wrong because he shouldn't have been charged at all. He should have been let to go. Anyway, so law and order people are people who stick to the law with so rigid without thinking of what circumstances people are living in, because they privilege order. And you hear the word order used a lot by government officials. Then the right also talks of competition in commerce. So for them, their big thing is that enterprise comes from competition. And so the right tends to favor big business at the expense of the environment and at the expense of people's rights, workers' rights, all that kind of thing. That's what the right tends to support. The right also tends to be evangelical. And I want to qualify that this relationship was not always there. This is a new relationship between the American right and evangelicalism, which started after the civil rights movement. I think that once they saw the power of faith in the way people like Martin Luther King Jr. and the way Malcolm X spoke, I think the right realized that they can talk about politics using religious language, but never have to mention racism. And I have a video in which I have explained this, because when we got CBC, people were supporting evangelical talking points like parental involvement. That's why I'm saying that it's important for us to understand what the right and the left are. So evangelical, the political right tends to be evangelical. In Europe, it doesn't apply because the church is still part of the state. And in the countries that are still monarchies, the monarch is also the head of the church. So that's why evangelicalism doesn't apply in Europe. And what happens is that because our intellectual heritage is European, we have the same contempt for evangelicals that the Europeans do. And I've explained this in an article, which I will put the link below. And in an interview with the elephant, which I did with Joe Kobuthi. Then the right it tends to frown on the state providing social services. They think that social services should be open to market competition. So things like healthcare and education, they believe that those should not be provided by the government, but should be provided by businesses. So, you know, you go to the hospital and then you take your kid to the school you can afford. They feel that if you try to have a state-provided services that are equal to everyone, that is undermining business and enterprise and talent and all that capitalist nonsense. The other thing that the right believes is that the rich should be allowed to make as much money as they can at whatever cost, and they should not have to pay taxes. That any concerns about inequality, if the rich get too rich, the money can trickle down to people through either jobs or philanthropy, through donor-funded foundations. So they say the rich should not be obliged to share their wealth with the rest of the society. It should be left up to their individual conscience. Of course, it has never happened. It doesn't work, but they still believe that. Finally, which is kind of a summary, I think the right are people who believe in nationhood. It's about one group of people who think the same, talk the same, believe the same, have the same values. And if you join that nation, you need to conform. And they tend to be quite violent if you don't. They believe in law and order to straighten you up. Now let's come to the left. The left, unlike the right that believes in hierarchy and tradition, the left believes in class consciousness. So they believe that there are other ways to group with each other than which family you are born into, like profession, and you have unions, you have neighborhoods. If you work in a factory, you have solidarity with workers. So they believe in class consciousness as opposed to identity. They also believe that law and order is not absolute. There should be consideration of social context. Like in the example I gave, if you have a poor man who cannot afford to pay 50,000 to get his wife out of hospital, should you jail him? Or if we look at the way the law of theft is applied, somebody who steals a chicken gets 7 years, and somebody who steals 400 million gets a slap on the wrist. So people on the left think about those kinds of inequalities. They do not treat the law as neutral. The left also is very skeptical of monopoly capital. Unlike the right, who want to encourage big business, the left think that the state should control, or politics should control, how business operates. So the left thinks that the business should not be allowed to pollute. They should be responsible to the environment. They should pay workers well, and they should not monopolize business. There should be antitrust laws, because if you have monopolies, you usually have a very insecure economy that is subject to constant booms and busts, as they call it. And so they believe that the state or politics should regulate business. The left also, when it comes to religion, the left is split into two. The right generally tends to support individualist religion called evangelicalism. But on the left, there are two views. One is that, which is the more European one because of their history, that religion should be left alone altogether. But there are others who see religion as a source of inspiration in the fight for justice. And so you have liberation theology, which came from South America, Black theology of James Cone in the US, or you have Malcolm X, who was a person of faith fighting for justice. So people on the left, some of them, not all, don't see a distinction. They don't believe that religion is incapable of incorporating or being about justice. That also means that Christians who are socially conscious, they see Jesus not as a white blonde guy who is there to whip people to heaven or hell, but a Palestinian who was persecuted under the Roman Empire. And so they see Jesus's life as necessarily political and as making political demands on society. And this is one of my points of impatience with Kenyans, because what Kenyans do is that they take the European secular position, not realizing it's European and thinking they are anti-colonial. So you can see there's a lot of confusion about our political ideas. There are a lot of ideas which Kenyans, especially the middle class, believe to be anti-colonial, which are actually Republican. Even like what I was saying about tradition, the way we talk about tradition is a lot the way the queen would talk, or the king, sorry, would talk about tradition as this fixed thing that is so rigid, that never moves, that doesn't adapt, and which should be the all and all of any kind of value, which is a very Republican kind of view of culture. But you will see in I'll put a link below, in my article on conservatism, I talk a little more about that. And then the left also believe that the state should provide social services, meaning we should have education and healthcare provided for by the state so that everybody has access to health, whether they are poor or rich. So they are different from the right. The right believe that get the healthcare from where you can afford, the education from where you can afford. And as the left thinks that education and healthcare, if they are right for everybody, everybody should have access to a decent healthcare and decent education. Because if you just leave those things to the market, that builds on the inequality, because the poor are not able to get an education, or they're not able to get well because they can't afford to be treated. So that's another difference. The left thinks that social services should be provided by the state, while the right thinks they should be provided by the market. And then also the left are very skeptical about that idea of, oh, the rich worked hard, and so they should not be taxed, and they should be let to allow their wealth to trickle down to the poor. The left doesn't buy that. They say that the rich are rich because of certain social circumstances that they are living in. Maybe they got a tender, which is what happens in Kenya. Maybe they got a tender, or they were born in a wealthy family. And so they already have some advantages when they are making wealth. And so the left are people who think that the rich should be taxed commensurate with their income. They don't believe in trickle-down economics like the right. In general, I would say that the attitude, or sort of the approach of the left to politics, is a historical materialist approach. Basically, what the left does is that they look at history through the material conditions of the people. Unlike the right, who think more of the nation in terms of identity. This king, this queen, we fought this war, this is who we are, this is our language. The left thinks differently. They think in terms of who did what and under what circumstances, who had access to what resources, which is called, and by Marxists, it's called historical materialism. And generally, the left also tend to think in terms of class rather than nation. So for them, they would see, for example, working class politics as the cutting across countries and not just limited to a certain country. So for them, they would see the interests of the working class in Kenya similar to the interests of the working class in Tanzania or in Senegal or in Sweden, wherever. They see an international solidarity regardless of national identity. For the right, then the solidarity is based on identity and largely on race. Between these two is now where you have the center. And the Democrats, this is where they fall. The center are the people who they catch a break especially through education, or maybe they are able to, through some ingenuity or some good luck, they're able to make some good money. And so these people tend to be closer in terms of their political ideas to the right, because they believe that where they are, they got there through their hard work. And so one of the problems with the way Kenyans understand US politics from the perspective of Fox News is that they fail to see that the Democrats and the Republicans basically share the same politics. What they differ on is their identity. People in the Democratic Party believe that there should be more diversity at the top in terms of power, but most of all, they believe that where they are, the wealth they had, the power they got it through their sheer hard work and talent. So people in the center tend to believe in merit. And this was reinforced a lot by Obama, because he went to all the good schools and got to become the president of the United States. And there are a lot of people who believe like him that it's just a matter of diversifying the ruling class with these people who have managed to get into it through business like Oprah, or through school, or through politics. So what was the problem of the Democratic campaign this year? The problem was that the people who were driving the Democratic campaign were people like Kamala, people who were where they are because of having gotten a good education, and they rose to the top. And then, as I will explain in another video, the Democratic Party decided to abandon the working class. So traditionally, especially from the 70s, the Democratic Party was supposed to represent the working class and the minorities. But they slowly abandoned representing the working class and decided that the minorities, like especially Black Americans, will always vote Democratic. So there's no need to campaign on the issue or to address the issues faced by Black people, since they will vote for the Democratic Party anyway, because they have nowhere else to go. And that madharau is what African Americans got tired of. They said, we can't keep on voting for you, and you people taking our votes for granted, and you're presenting nothing for us that matters to us. And so even though African Americans still voted overwhelmingly for Kamala, the turnout was not what the Democratic Party hoped for, and they were warned that the path they were taking was not going to work. Basically, the Democratic Party decided they wanted to appeal to the moderate Republicans, the Republicans who have college education like them and tend to be a bit more liberal in their cultural views. Those were the people they were hoping to appeal to, and that's hence you saw this thing of Dick Cheney and Liz Cheney in the Kamala Harris campaign, because they had decided that they were not going to care about the working class or minorities. And that's the gap that Donald Trump took. He saw that the material concerns of Americans, like minimum wage, like jobs, he could pretend or talk as if he cared about those things, since the Democratic Party clearly didn't care about them. So what does this say about Kenyans and the way we interpret US politics? On one hand, in terms of our political and economic outlook, we tend to be Republican, especially the middle class. There's a way you'll even hear people saying law and order, merit, people should be promoted on merit and not identity, all that kind of thing. We tend also not to care for the poor. So, for example, when I was talking about CBC, my greatest concern was about inequality, not only in terms of the resources for schools of the poor, but I was asking, what are we saying when we are saying talent is what is going to decide how a child advances in school? It means children of parents who do not know how to read or can't do the homework, they'll be disadvantaged. This was something that Kenyans, especially the educated, didn't care about. For them, they just wanted to know, how can I get the textbook so that my kid can have a head start? It's a very democratic kind of approach to the political economy, but also it's Republican in the sense that we don't want things to fundamentally change. What we care about is our individual positions in the economy. So there's a lot of confusion among Kenyans about whether they fall on the Democratic or the Republican side. The other thing is that even though we may not care much for abortion because we are culturally conservative or for LGBTQ rights, we tend to have our own identity rhetoric, which is generally in terms of ethnicity and gender. So we still use identity to negotiate instead of talking about the structures that make some places marginalized, so that people from those areas have to struggle more than people from the other areas closer to the railway. So what happened with these elections in the US? What happened is that the Democratic Party, which was the party that was expected to talk about the issues or the concerns of the working class, like healthcare, like minimum wage, like college debt, price of groceries. Those were the things that Democrats were traditionally expected to talk about because they were supposedly the party of the working class. They were also supposed to be concerned about minorities, when it comes to African Americans, the issue of reparations, the issue of the police. What the Democrats did was to drop those issues and instead pick the cultural ones that they thought would appeal to white suburban women. And that's why they went on and on about abortion. It wasn't simply about women's right to choose. They were appealing to a certain demographic of women whom they thought were college educated and would care about those issues. What the Republicans did was they spotted a gap and they took it over. So Trump knew that people are concerned about their jobs. He played on the xenophobia of Americans and the ignorance of Americans. He told them their economic troubles are from immigration. And he also appealed to the fact that Americans are tired of wars that are being fought using their money when they are struggling to make a living. So he took that gap and exploited it. And that is why, even though Trump may not necessarily do the things he seems to promise Americans that he will do in terms of the economy, Americans felt that at least he has seen that there's a problem and he'll stick it up to the system. It's even so bizarre that the Democrats thought that appealing to college-educated people only would work when only 40% of Americans have a college degree, and many of them are paying huge debts for having gone to university, and the Democrats didn't even want to talk about those debts. So I don't know how they were thinking. And in the next video, when I talk about the problem of elite education, there was a way in which they were deaf, complete Barbies. They just had no sensibility of what ordinary life for the ordinary American feels like. And this should not be so foreign, because this is what happened in 2022 with our elections. Putting the question of rigging and whatever aside, we had the same kind of campaigns in Kenya. We had two main parties, just like the US. We had two main parties where third parties like Reuben Kigame, Communist Party of Kenya, were not being allowed to even get on the ballot, which also happened in the US with Jill Stein. The Democratic Party went and campaigned for the Green Party. They took the Green Party to court so that their names would not be on the ballot. That's the same thing that happened here in 2022. So they blocked people from getting on the ballot, number one, the whole establishment. But number two, our politics was divided into two main parties along the same line. We had one party that was conservative, but they knew that people wanted to talk about material issues, the hustlers. They knew that a lot of Kenyans were struggling with getting money for business, cost of living, and unga. And so they appealed to that, while the other party did the snobbish posh kind of, we are educated. So as we are going to talk about the diversity. So they had a woman running mate for the Azimio coalition, and they were talking about, oh, we promise diversity, everybody is going to be included in our government if we win. It was the same thing that was in the US with the Republicans and the Democrats. And just like I think that Trump will probably not deliver on the promises he's making to the American working class, that's the same thing that happened here. We got somebody talking to hustlers and saying that he cares about hustlers, but what has happened to healthcare? Healthcare has been privatized even further so that maybe more people might access healthcare, but it will be of a worse quality. And then they have privatized healthcare because they are telling us that if we don't get the services we want under SHIF, or if our money runs out, we can always pay for more. That's privatization of healthcare. So Kenya Kwanza was not honest in saying that they care about the hustlers. It was just rhetoric, and I think that's the same thing with Trump. But that comes from when you have elites who think that they are so educated and they can't be able to connect with the common issues, and so so other people take advantage of that gap and use it to campaign. And that's what I think happened in the 2022 Kenya elections. Let me come back to the question that Kenyans have also been talking about, of whether Trump's win is good for Africa. I think it's too difficult to tell because Trump is very volatile. He's not consistent. And actually, that's what people love about him, that he doesn't care for principle, these bourgeois posh principles of being consistent and principled and educated. He doesn't care. He goes with his gut, and it's understandable that people are so tired of high sounding things and they just want somebody to be a little more realistic and human. But that also means that you can't tell in principle whether he will care about Africa or not. Kenyans have been saying that because he's a racist and he doesn't care for the pretense of the Democrats, that he won't bother about Africa, and maybe, we can get the US ambassador to be recalled, and maybe he won't invest as much in the US Army. And now that he probably will end the Ukraine war, it looks like he's not a war president. But we have to remember that the Ukraine issue is an intra-European one. Ukrainians are Europeans, Russians are Europeans, America is ruled by Europeans. But when it comes to the genocide in Gaza, Trump is basically not going to change much because that is a war of Europeans against Arabs. So he's probably not going to take a different position than Biden and Kamala took. For that reason, he will probably not care very much to withdraw troops, American troops from the African continent. But also, it's not even a race problem, it's a big business issue. Because if there are big businesses interested in exploiting the African continent, Trump will support them. Like Big Pharma, I believe, are behind our healthcare problems. Even all these vaccines that are being brought to us, all these medications and the clinical trials that are tested on us, that's Big Pharma. And since Trump supports private healthcare and healthcare as a business, it's unlikely that he would prevent or block Big Pharma from exploiting the continent because it's about business. So it's too early to tell what will happen. Of course, we can predict with some social programs and cultural programs that are funded by the US government. But when it comes to exploitation of the continent, I think that one will go on full steam ahead because of business interests, not because he wants to make a cultural point. That said, I think the bigger issue for me here is not Trump and America and Africa. The issue is us. Kenya, it's not good to be ignorant. You know, when people are saying that CNN is on the left, no, that's not acceptable. Even if you still want to support the Republicans, at least get your facts right. Get the historical basics right. Let's not be ignorant about the positions that we take. So because we have been feeding on a steady diet of reactionary right-wing media and liberal media, I'm going to suggest some Black American media that tend to be on the left, so that you can have at least a balanced view of what is going on. For me, the reason why I was not interested in the two parties. Even in 2022, I had gotten tired of this two-horse race. I noticed what was being done to people like Ruben Kigame and to Buka Omole by the establishment. So I'm generally a person who has no care for the duopoly, as Margaret Kimberly calls it. And I interviewed her on that. So I'm going to suggest some other media sources for you to get a broader view of US politics, so that, and this is not about you taking the view of the Black left, although I would be happy if you did, but you hearing another side so that you can get some of the concepts right. I'll suggest, for example, the Bad Faith podcast, which is done by Brianna Joy Gray. I really like it. Her interviews are excellent. She's very knowledgeable. Sabi Sabs is another good Black left YouTube channel. I encourage you to check it out. She releases content all the time, and she tends to be very pro-working class, so that's a good channel. There's the Black Liberation Media, which is a collection of different journalists and programs. So if you check them on YouTube, you'll find some really good shows and guests. And then, of course, I will suggest Black Agenda Report, which is where Margaret Kimberly comes from. It's a good... What I like about Black Agenda Report is that they are really conscious about not just Black Americans, but the entire Black world, from South America to Africa to Europe. So it's a very good website. This year, I also really enjoyed listening to Dr. Butch Ware, who was the running mate of Jill Stein on the Green Party. He has a very good knowledge of the Black radical tradition. So it was really nice to hear interpretations of Black thinkers. He was talking a lot about people like Kwame Ture, Malcolm X. He was talking about Africa. He did some of his studies in Senegal. So these are resources which are worth looking for. The Black Alliance for Peace, which there's a member of Black Alliance for Peace who I interviewed on Haiti. That's Jemima Pierre. So all these resources are good for you to get a broader view of the politics in the US, so that you're not just relying on Tucker Carlson and Fox News. I think, of course, I'm also hopeful that even African media can go in that direction. We are trying with the news media like Africa Stream. I don't quite agree with a lot of the things they do. I think they are a bit too dramatic for me and not educational enough. But I think there's a recognition even on the continent that we need a broader view of our politics. We need to know not just about our countries, but also about the continent and how our destinies are related to people, our people in the diaspora. And that means we also need to be careful. I think the CIA has noticed that Africans are thirsting for Pan-African analysis. So we also need to know that you might stumble into Pan-African channels that are also on the right, even though they are talking about Africa. I think the basic idea is that we are swimming among sharks, basically, and we cannot afford to be naive. and listen only to the popular media, mainstream media of the US. We need to do the reading. We need to read our history. And so I hope that we'll be more informed when we are talking about American politics. So in the next video, I'm going to talk about how did the Democratic Party become such a Barbie party that they couldn't hear what Americans were saying are concerns for them until Kamala Harris was resoundingly beaten by Donald Trump. Thank you for watching.